Thank you, everyone. While it is sad that it is our concluding session after our 4 days together, we do have a lot of exciting material to cover and people to hear from in this last session. And because I know time has a tendency to slip away from all of us, I want to first say a big thank you to all my colleagues here at the Carter Center. Karen and I would like to thank all of them because this truly could not have happened without them. So first of all, I really want to thank events, Lisa's team, both Molly and Ben, finance, Ramiro's team, Olivia, communication team, Soya and Rennie, all the interns, all the volunteers. Also from the Democracy Program, those people that were helping us out, Erica Jert, Jennifer Phillips, Ana Caridad from the Latin American Caribbean Program, and from the Human Rights Program, Jason Parker and Faiza Badmus-Busari, who are standing in the back. And finally, I would like to thank Talisha Harrison, our program assistant, who is coordinating all of this. And we actually, Talisha, we actually owe you 2 thank yous, not only for this forum, but
You do the same thing I do.
But what most of you may not know is this is her last week with us at the Carter Center. We are so happy for her because she's pursuing her dreams. She is a civil rights, human rights activist at the core, but she has an opportunity in her field of social and health sciences to pursue that, and we are so happy for you, Talisha. Thank you for everything. Now it is my pleasure to tell you about the revision that is on your desk. We are of the statement. We are still taking people's input, preferably in writing, would really help Karen and I. But I do want to point out to you the 2 most significant revisions in this draft. And the changes, the most significant changes are that President Carter wanted to emphasize the need to urgently address the unequal treatment of people. And we heard that from you as well in the session. And he also added a quotation. We hope to have some time for a little bit of discussion about this later, but I wanted to point that out to you now. And now it is with great pleasure that I introduce Andrew Gilmour, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights at the United Nations. He assumed his functions in October 2016, heading the High Commissioner's office in New York. In his previous position as Director for Political, Peacekeeping, Humanitarian, and Human Rights Affairs in the Executive Office of the Secretary General, Mr. Gilmour was responsible for spearheading the implementation of the Human Rights Upfront initiative. Since joining the United Nations in 1989, he has held a variety of positions, both at the United Nations headquarters and in the field, including in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kosovo, State of Palestine, and West Africa. In recent years, he has served as Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in Iraq and in South Sudan, and was the representative of the Secretary General in Belgrade. Mr. Gilmour, thank you for joining us.
Sorry. Thank you so much. It's a tremendous honor to be here, Mr. President, and again for the 2nd year running, actually, and wonderful to see so many incredibly distinguished and brave human rights defenders. As just mentioned, I come from the UN, where President Carter is still a yardstick for compassion and principle, and it's particularly great to be here again. So, in general, I would say there's never been a greater need, certainly in my pretty long involvement. Actually, I joined Amnesty International during President Carter's term in office, so I've been involved in it for quite a long time, and I don't think there's perhaps been a greater need for the work that you do, because I think there is actually no question that after the 30 years of flourishing of human rights that began with a major impetus from President Carter himself in the late 70s, that there is now not just a a halting of progress, but actually a full-on backlash. And we feel that in so many places, at so many levels, and on so many issues. And women's issues is one particularly obvious one, but indigenous ones, migrants and refugees, and minorities in so many places that one sees this backlash. At the UN, where we see it, we see some previous champions of human rights have gone remarkably silent, whereas those who have always been pretty skeptical at best, hostile at worst, are newly emboldened and are very upfront in what they're trying to do, whether it's to cut our budget, whether it's to denigrate those of us working for the UN human rights, whether it's denigrating civil society or the UN Human Rights Council. And it is an attempt also to silence us and to stop us getting our message out. But if we feel that at the UN, how much more you, on the sharp end of the spear, must be feeling that backlash. And I know it's a very major issue. And this is why the Human Rights Declaration is so important. Now, I'd say in general, I'm not a tremendous fan of anniversaries. The UN is permanently, it seems, celebrating some anniversary or another, usually sort of contrasting some great ideal with the sort of disappointing realities. But there are several that I've even heard in the short time I've been here, and I wanted to just mention some of them. One, of course, the Universal Declaration, 70 years. Secondly, the 20th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration. Thirdly, the 25th anniversary of the Vienna Declaration, which I'll come to. And fourthly, last week was Nelson Mandela's 100th birthday. So it's a Human Rights Declaration that I was asked to speak about, but I'm just going to, after talking about that, I'm going to mention the other three as well. The Human Rights Declaration recognizes that human rights is a right in itself, and it clarifies how human rights apply to defenders. And it's remarkable to me how few people, even in our field, really know about it, and hence the great importance of the Norwegian initiative to revitalize it and to commemorate it. It's articulated and elaborated on existing rights with specific regard to human rights defenders. And the fact that it was a consensus, although it took 15 long years to reach it, is very important. Now, you've been talking, inevitably, I know a lot about you've been talking about the attacks on human rights defenders. And while killings and disappearances and torture of human rights defenders has been perpetrated for a long time, it seems that there are new ways of attacking you and your colleagues that didn't exist when the Human Rights Declaration came out with 20 years ago. And of course, the primary one relates to the internet and social media, which can be a tremendous benefit to human rights defenders. In this country, Black Lives Matter and Me Too was obviously driven in large part by social media. Elsewhere, the Arab Spring, Pussy Riot, or the Green Movement in Iran, all of these were very important in terms of the media, in terms of using social media. But at the same time, these can also be used against you, and we are seeing that. And there are various ways, one of which is a strong level of surveillance. It's not only what you're posting on social media, now governments can see what sites you even look at, and you can be punished in some countries for doing that. There's also very sophisticated cyber trolling and cyberbullying, and I would say disinformation campaigns. Perhaps the most successful one is the one that was launched about 2 years ago against the White Helmets of Syria, which was and it came from Russia, and it was massive and complex, and it was launched and has successfully changed the view of people who actually who spend their lives digging people out of the rubble and photographing remains of bodies and people victims of attack and portraying them as either sympathizers of terrorists or as Western intelligence agencies. But that is a successful form of disinformation, and it will not be the only human rights organization that will get that treatment. Another development is not so much high-tech, but one where we see human rights defenders increasingly being labeled as supporters of terrorists. And in country after country, you see governments stepping back and just trying to tarnish anybody. We heard earlier about Indigenous, that you're seen as hostile to development, and you mentioned that in the previous session, but also being accused of being sympathetic to terrorists. And incidentally, it isn't just human rights NGOs. They've begun to attack our office as well. Usually it's a bit so subtle that we're accused of sympathizing with terrorists, but just 3 months ago, the Turkish government took us on absolutely and explicitly accused us, our office, of aiding and abetting terrorism because we came up with a report on conditions with the Kurds and also in the post-coup situation. And there was a famous case with the Chinese government to have accused a leading Uyghur activist of being a terrorist and trying to prevent him repeatedly from entering UN premises, both in Geneva and in New York. And of course, and we're seeing more and more of it, you see governments trying to restrict civil NGOs, human rights organizations, through their funding and other methods. Last year, I was particularly struck by the head of B'Tselem in Israel gave a very good description of what it was like when the Israeli government was targeting his organization and preventing it from trying to do its work. But there are now, we've listed that more than 90 states have now come up with laws curtailing civil society or their funding. So protecting and expanding civil society space and defending human rights defenders is, I would say, the centerpiece of what the UN High Commission for Human Rights is supposed to be about, and it's something that we work very hard on. But nearly 2 years ago, the Secretary General created a new mandate and gave it to me on top of other things, but to be focal point for reprisals, those who suffer reprisal for cooperating with the UN on human rights issues. And as a result of this, we are seeing, and you will have encountered them yourselves, or at least heard of them, that the many, many different forms, whether it's through smearing online, whether it is direct threats, whether it's preventing people from traveling, whether it's preventing people from medical treatment, medical. So all these forms of reprisal, and it's growing. Last year, the report of the Secretary General that our office did listed 32 countries that have carried out these actions. And this year it will be, and that's higher than in all the previous years, and this year it will be comparable. Last September, I presented the report to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and to the member states. I said it was abhorrent that year after year we have to go and present a report to you, member states, outlining examples of how member states are targeting human rights defenders and others for cooperating with UN-mandated organizations that you yourselves have set up. And I said such human rights defenders should be regarded as the canary in the coal mine who are sort of bravely singing until they are silenced by the toxic backlash against human rights that serves as a dark warning to us all. I understand that earlier today people talked about an infrastructure for human rights defenders, and I would really like to see what we can do to build on that and what we can do at the UN to encourage that. So the shrinking of civic society is, of course, is a threshold issue. You cannot do your work. Actually, governments can't do their work, although they don't really realize that in every situation. And the UN can't, whether it's our work in peace and security or development or human rights, unless we are able to interact with civil society, those who can actually point out the benefits or the non-benefits of particularly government policies. So, which is why we think it's such an emblematic issue for all of us. So what can we do to defend, to protect human rights defenders in this year? Now, there are many ways. I mean, what we're trying to do, and I speak about it often, if we can get other people who are not, unlike you, full-time involved in human rights, but just to provide support, whether it's writing to your newspapers or to your congressmen or to other politicians, and just raising the issue. Because I work for the UN organization that is, amongst governments, by far the least popular, because we speak out about human rights abuses. And so we're the ones, yesterday I was briefing the Security Council, and I was asked, several agencies were, and they all talked about that they have a problem of they don't have unfettered access to Burma or Myanmar. I said, well, at least you have fettered access. We have no access whatsoever, because, I mean, and that is one of many countries where Venezuela is another, where we cannot even get a foot in. But one of the consolations of working for that organization is that one does see that even though governments claim that they don't really care what the UN thinks, the very virulence of their opposition to us, of their protest, when we actually call them out, when they come in and blast us, that proves a lie to that, because it shows that they do have some shame. It may not affect their actions, but at least it does show that there is a sensitivity there, and that's why we are determined to carry on, because actually it isn't true. They do care what the UN says, so we have to carry on doing that. So, making people more aware of the human rights declaration is something very important. And one of the things that we try to do, we have to make sure that the UN is more open to civil society. And we try our best on that. But I have to say, I alluded to it just now in the case of the Uyghur, very powerful governments try to restrict civil society's access to the UN. Briefly, I'd like to mention the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I do think this is a very useful tool for all of us in the human rights movement, because many governments find the whole discourse of human rights anathema to them, but they all agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals. And although those human rights are not explicitly mentioned very often in that, they are implicitly there throughout, especially with the mantra, leave no one behind, which is based on non-discrimination, and the disaggregated data. And I do believe that the government can't object if you're working with them on that. So it's something that I feel is an important sort of back door to get in. And so I understand you were talking about the indivisibility of human rights, and this is something is really, really important. The Universal Declaration, of course, since it came after both the Second World War, but also the Great Depression of the 30s, was infused with the whole spectrum, economic and social, but also the civil and political. But that's, unfortunately, after the war, after the declaration, it sort of bifurcated into two directions. And it was only really in 1993, through the Vienna Declaration, that people understood the indivisibility. And that was a unique moment in time at the end of the Cold War. People felt that there was democracy and human rights would be the new norm. And it was also, interestingly, it was because it was just at the beginning of the Bosnian War, where Christian Serbs were publicly, and it was throughout the world, was seen as carrying out atrocities against Muslims. It took away the ability of some people to say that these were just Western rights and that human rights was an entirely Western phenomenon. Because this is now back at the UN. We have, obviously, some major countries pushing back on economic and social rights, saying they're not relevant. It's actually a form of socialism, and you should just stick to civil and political. But increasingly, we get other countries repeatedly saying that civil and political rights are not universal, they are Western rights. And that was why I was very happy last week on Mandela's 100th birthday, I was with his granddaughter launching his book on prison letters, because it enabled me to sort of point out that here was a man who all his life had talked about how poverty, while there's poverty, you cannot be truly free, and how restrictions on economic activity are obviously human rights violations. So he's very strong on that. But can you imagine, even somebody as notoriously courteous as him, I can't imagine if somebody told him that actually the right not to be tortured is a Western right, or the right to vote, or the right to join a political party, or the right not to be thrown into jail for arbitrary purposes. I mean, he was obviously not a Westerner, but very few leaders ever have been such an exponent of both economic and social and political rights. And that is something that I think is really, really important. And I'm very happy to have heard that earlier today we've been putting a stress also on economic and social rights. And I feel that all of us have to keep this together. There are on different sides of the divide, and it's not the same exactly as the Cold War divide in the UN now, but there is a divide on this civil and political versus economic and social. But we have to hold the line that they are indivisible and interrelated. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me to make that point.
Well, I think we've just heard the comments of the most important person maybe in the world on human rights, the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations on Human Rights. Back in 1993, the Carter Center was embarked on a major effort. Karen and I were working together with others at the Carter Center to authorize the establishment of a Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for Human Rights. High Commission on Human Rights. And this has been a very important element. We had an argument with Boutros Ghali in Vienna in 1993 about it. He and I almost came to blows because I thought we ought to elevate human rights in the United Nations, and he thought that any more officials in the United Nations was an encroachment on his prerogatives. But I think that the fact that Ambassador Gilmour is from Norway adds substance to his discussions, because I don't think any nation on earth more effectively and beautifully represent the ideal of human rights than Norway does. So I want to thank him for being here. It makes me feel very good to have him and to be in his presence. I enjoyed having lunch with him today, and I just wanted to express my thanks for his very fine presentation a few minutes ago. Thank you very much.
So we have a few moments to follow up with the speakers that had raised their tent cards before. We will start with Anthony Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President Jimmy Carter. Thank you, Carter Center. I'm Anthony from Vietnam. At home, under the communist government, our people don't have human rights, even the rights to talk about human rights. So, over 10 years, involves the movement to the revolution, hundreds of my friends are in jail because we promote the human rights. So I'm here today to ask for help how to promote human rights to our people in land. We need your help to stand with us on the battle of promoting human rights to our people. Thank you very much.
Miriam, would you like to?
Thank you. First of all, let me thank Carter Center and then President Carter and Mrs. Carter for this opportunity for us to be here. I'm actually from the Maldives. I never had a chance to actually give a picture of what is happening in our country, which is atrocious at the moment. I'm sure Human Rights Council would know very well what I'm talking about. The Maldives is best known for its sparkling crystal clear water and abundance of sea life and idyllic white sandy beaches. But it is fast becoming known for something much more disturbing, its rapid descent into religious extremism, pushing the rights of women and girls decades behind, and pushing hundreds of youth, especially boys, towards the so-called jihad. In fact, per capita comparison shows that Maldives is among the highest contributors of fighters towards this horrific cause. Meanwhile, political greed and turmoil has given way to shocking levels of corruption at all levels, among many other wiles. Although largely ignored even to this day, Corruption compromises states' ability to fulfill their obligation to promote, respect, and protect the human rights of individuals within their jurisdictions. Human rights are indivisible and interdependent, and the consequences of corruption are multiple and touch on all human rights: civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and on the right to development. There is also an alarming increase in violence, especially against women and girls. The culture of victimizing the victim, societal norms that encourage ethos of silence, especially in case of women and girls, and lack of visible, appropriate legal action by relevant authorities encourage perpetrators in Maldives for more violence. Widespread intolerance is the root cause of human rights violence. Human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and other human rights champions in our country and across the world are facing unparalleled levels of oppression, humiliation, and harassment, extortion, and violence, as many people have stated over here. Leaders across many continents are increasingly dismantling the foundations needed for a free, just, and equal society. What we are witnessing today is a full frontal onslaught by governments, armed groups, corporations, and others with power on the very right to defend human rights. By removing their right to protest, placing them under surveillance, and targeting them and their communities with harassment, threats, and physical attacks, governments are choking off the oxygen supply to those standing up for our own rights. Obviously, the absence of tolerance is not only a denial of human rights, but human dignity. It is also the root of the suffering and hatred that breeds political violence and inhibits economic development, which is happening in our country. Authoritarian leaders intent on crushing human rights would have us believe that only they have our best interests at heart, but they don't. It is in fact those who defend our human rights who are standing up for us, and they face persecution for daring to do so. We live in an age of human rights. The language of human rights has become omnipresent, used for expressing the most basic demands of justice. Some are old demands, such as the prohibition of torture and slavery. Others are newer, such as claims to internet access or same-sex marriages. But what are human rights, and where do they come from? This question is made urgent by a disquieting thought. Perhaps people with clashing values and convictions can so easily appeal to human rights only because ultimately they don't agree on what they are talking about. Maybe the apparently widespread consensus on the significance of human rights depends on the emptiness of that very notion. If this is true, then talk of human rights is rhetorical, window dressing, masking deeper ethical and political divisions. Thank you.
Mary?
Oh, okay. All right.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura, for giving me the second chance. Mr. President, it is really a great privilege for me to be from Afghanistan here. I hope that you remember me. This is me, Mori Akrami. I just wanted to raise your attention regarding the women's movement in Afghanistan, which is after 2001, there was a lot of attention, there was a lot of investment on women's movement in Afghanistan, but unfortunately now we see that women are trying to keep women aside. And there is like lack of security, lack of protection for human rights defenders. There is no system at all for human rights defenders to provide them protection. As the organization that we are providing shelter, you remember that since 2003, and there was around 10,000 women got protected. But nowadays that we know, like we see that the problem of lack of funding for women shelters in Afghanistan, which is a huge challenge for us because we don't have that one challenge as a human rights defenders to protect women. We have challenge to have our space on the all peace process, to have our space as a voice of women at the different levels, to have our space like by forcing everyone still that, but unfortunately still we see those challenges. This is the biggest challenge. More than 100 women right now that they are living in the safe houses, but unfortunately there is no lack of interest, lack of funding for that. The shelter fund will be ended in end of this September. Since last year that we had fight for that, but unfortunately we didn't see any donors, and particularly the U.S. government. This is really disappointing us that we received the award in 2007 as a Women's of Courage award that I have got, but now we are knocking the door of donors to get fund for supporting women's organization, and particularly for women's shelter in Afghanistan. I need to raise this and to draw your attention. You remember like the Giti Askarzada, the one that without your support, she was not able to be here and to have her to reach to her dreams. Like Giti, there is 100 other girls in Afghanistan which they are every day they are facing challenges, they are facing sexual abuse, they are facing domestic violence. We are there to support them, and we don't have no one to be behind us. That's why that I wanted to draw your attention and draw attention of the international community in this regard. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much. I want to bring back the issue of the indigenous minorities, the subject that we focused on before we went on break. The fact that some of them in their struggle to obtain a more dignified life are characterized as extremist group, and so therefore they become subject of attack by governments. I think their case needs to be looked into seriously, and there are very good examples of such indigenous minorities whose lives have been so deteriorated, living in abject deprivation, and the reason for which certain violence and conflicts have arisen. It's important to appreciate also that most of the conflicts we have in the world, tensions, there are two important factors underpin them. One is power, and the other one is resources. Whenever there's competition for power, we are likely to have conflicts and war. Whenever there is unequitable or unjust distribution of resources, and those who suffer the deprivation will rise up. And that is the case for indigenous minorities. In Nigeria, for example, the eastern side, Ogoni, because so much oil was being exploited in that area to the disadvantage of the local people, indigenous people. What happened was that the young people now took over the law into their own hands, and they were taking expatriates hostage. And they use it as a tool to extract what they think is their right. If we don't deal with it, then this phenomenon, in my own country, there are areas, for example, where mining extractive, industry, gold. If you go to Obuasi, for example, this industry began when I don't know whether my great-grandfather had even been born. And yet you go to this area, it is one of the most deprived cities that you can think of in Ghana. At Takwa, another gold mining area, it's so. At Nsuta, it is so. Pristia, you will cry when you get there and you see the life of the people who are the locals there. In matters of economic right, what is it that we need to do to ensure that such companies, when they are located in such areas, will make sure that the local people have a dignified life? And I think that is an abuse of their human right, and that underpins some of the conflicts that we see. So we share the plight of those indigenous minorities, but what is it that we can do at a higher level to ensure that their due is given to them?
Thank you, Sheikh Shuaib. Now, may I turn to you, President Carter, for some concluding remarks?
I don't know that I have any concluding remarks, but I would like to say, before we have the question and answer period, that this entire process has been very inspirational to me and challenging to me. It's obvious that, except for the United Nations and its organizations, including the council and so forth, there's not a very clear voice that can speak loud enough on these issues to keep them in the forefront of a consciousness of human beings. And I guess that most citizens of most countries, if you ask them the basic elementary questions about human rights, do you think the average person should have a right to a decent home or a job or medical care or freedom or a good job? They would answer yes, because most people would agree with that. But we don't have the capability that is extant now to keep these issues on the forefront of a consciousness of people in the world. And that includes the defenders who have been mentioned several times here, with hundreds being killed each year. My hope is that in future years that the Carter Center will do a very close analysis, and that we will see how the Carter Center can, in every individual case, magnify your voice. And for a long time, Karen and I would analyze all the issues that came to us involving human rights violations in different parts of the world. And just to make sure we didn't make a serious legal mistake, we got the Emory University Law Department, where I have taught now for 36 years in several departments, to analyze them for us. And then we would pick out the most notable and exemplary examples of individual cases. And first I would write a private letter to the president of that country, wherein the human rights violation was taking place, or where defenders were being killed or imprisoned. And I would tell him that I didn't want to go public with condemnation of his human rights policies, but I would like to hear directly from him about why somebody was imprisoned or someone was being abused, and ask him to respond. And if I didn't hear back from him, I would have to go public with the issue. And it was really surprising to Karen and to me, I think, at how many of them would say, okay, I think that particular person is going to be released. We won't hold him or her in prison any longer. I think the Carter Center should hope that in the future the Carter Center will become that kind of voice for you, so that individual cases that come up of human rights abuses can be exposed. The gentleman from Vietnam with whom I had lunch today pointed out that hundreds or even maybe 1,000 of his friends were imprisoned. I think most people in the United States, and maybe in Europe as well, now would say, well, we kind of take a breath of relief because the problems in Vietnam have been resolved. But if we had publicized a few of the key cases of human rights abuse going on in Vietnam now, just from a lonely voice of the Carter Center, I think it would put pressure on that government to stop their imprisonment of innocent people, of human rights defenders and so forth. So that's what I hope the Carter Center can do in the future. We don't have any authority, but we do have some influence. And in most of the countries in the world, in about 80 of them, we've had programs that have been beneficial to people, with eliminating guinea worm and river blindness, and promoting the concept of honest elections and things of that kind. So we do have some remnant of influence, maybe among existing leaders now. One thing that we must retain, I think, in our country is courage enough to speak out even when it may not be a popular thing to do. Because we have a great dependence on some of our financiers, donors who give us money to continue the Carter Center. But I think in the long term, being a voice for freedom and a voice for democracy, a voice for human rights, a voice for indigenous people, a voice for defenders who are abused, a voice for what is decent or right, a voice for the elimination of discrimination against any kind of people would be a very good thing to have. So that's what I hope that the Carter Center will do as a result of this session, and I hope that you'll be patient with us when we can't be successful, but yeah, I think it might be possibly beneficial to you to know that you've got friends here at the Carter Center who will back you up when we can and expand your voice and publicize your legitimate hopes for a better life. That's what I hope. But anyway, that's my closing comments. A little bit more longer than I thought.
It's time now for a very special part of our afternoon, a Q&A with President Carter. Let me take a moment to say again hello to those who are taking part in the conversation on Facebook. If you've just tuned in, welcome to the Carter Center's annual Human Rights Defenders Forum. We've spent the last 4 days together discussing the importance of economic and social rights and integrating them with civil and political rights, and talking about what we can do to restore faith in institutions and strengthen the social contract and faith in each other. Earlier today, members of both our in-person and online audiences submitted questions on these and related topics for President Carter, and we want to tackle as many of them as we can in these 20 minutes that we have. So now I'll turn it over to Karen.
President Carter, we have a few questions here from the press, Facebook, and from folks in the room, and I'll take a press question first. Are you worried that the U.S. is losing its place as a global leader in the protection and expansion of human rights?
I'm concerned because the United States has already lost its as a of protecting people and their human rights. We should be, to be a superpower, the United States should be the champion of human rights in the world. We're not the superpower because we have the largest military on earth or because we have the strongest economy in the world. We should be a superpower because we espouse things that are important to everyone on earth, and I think human rights are one of them. But the United States has already lost its long-time commitment to basic human rights. We were in the forefront when 70 years ago when the Universal Declaration was passed with Eleanor Roosevelt representing our country and with Harry Truman in the White House. And we still have a chance to restore our position as the foremost champion of human rights. But we are not in that position at this moment. And we had a conference a few years ago, about 15 years ago now, 10 or 12 years ago, when we realized that after 9/11, which took place in 2001, as you know, the United States clamped down on the basic rights of our own people and set a standard that was emulated around the world. And I'm afraid that if we retain our present position of indifference to human rights violations, we'll encourage human rights violations to grow even more rapidly than they have been in the past few years. So we have abandoned, basically, our position as a government to be the champion of human rights, and in a small way, I hope the Carter Center will take that place again.
In a related question, a human rights defender here asked, in a country like Pakistan, where there is rising extremism and terrorism, and state security often supersedes basic human rights, How do you safeguard human rights and national security interests and security?
Well, that exists not only in Pakistan, but to some degree in our country, in the United States, and in most countries in the world now. I think there's been, as our United Nations representative has just said, there's been a general deterioration in commitment to human rights all over the world. Looking at, there are some exceptions, but in general that's the case. So I think the best thing to do is to appeal to the inherent goodwill of most human beings. I mentioned that a little earlier, that most human beings think people ought to have their basic human rights, and publicize the violations and try to shame the violators. If it happens to be a corporation, I think that publicity about the violations they cause, that would include a logging company or a company that violates the rights of indigenous people in their native areas. I think that, or even the voices of people who speak out collectively, the larger the number that join in the outcry, the most effective it would be. And I think that would even have an effect on large governments like our own.
We have a question from Facebook. I make sure that I am an educated voter, but what else can I do to improve our issues here? I write and call my representatives, but I am not sure they are listening. What form of communication is most effective?
I think any form of communication is effective, even in your own family or your own circle of friends or in your own church or in your own local community, even as small as Plains, Georgia, or certainly like Atlanta. Letters to the editors always help. Writing to your congressman, sometimes particularly, or to, if that's not a receptive audience, your own particular congressman, find a member of Congress in the United States or Congress or the Senate to write a letter to someone who you know is speaking out in favor of women's rights or other rights, and write them and just share your concerns with them, because they quite often need support from individual people, and the more letters they get and the more correspondence they have, or the more telephone calls they get concerning an issue, the better they are. So just use your own voice and your own influence, whether it's a small circle of people or a large number, or direct to leaders in government. And of course, on election day, in a democracy, you can also have an impact if you vote for people who share your concerns about the issue that is important to you.
And from Twitter, we have a question. How can we handle illegal immigration without violating human rights?
I think if what the United States needs, as everybody knows, is a comprehensive bill that would be receiving bipartisan support, even if it's just a majority of the members of the House and Senate of the United States, that would give immigrants a clear picture of what they could expect when they get to the United States or apply for citizenship. This has not been done, and now there's a great deal of argument about people who are born here. There's a great deal of argument about children who come with their parents and who have been here for many years since they were little children, and have spent 20 years in the United States without any violation of law that's serious. So I think the clarification of the United States law would be the top thing I would say would be important. And I don't see that happening in the United States in the very near future. But there's legislation on the books in both the House and Senate of the United States to try to correct this problem.
And this is from the press again, what are your thoughts on the current racial divide within politics? Any solutions?
When I first went into politics a long time ago, and when I was elected president, I kind of breathed a sigh of relief because I thought finally with the advent of Martin Luther King Jr. and Andrew Young and John Lewis and other heroes, we had pretty well corrected the legal approval of a separate but equal or discriminatory racial practices. We had overcome with a war the civil rights commitment to slavery. And so I kind of felt at that time, 30 or 40 years ago, that the human rights issue had been resolved. Nowadays, it's come to the forefront again. And I think maybe it's been incipient or within the consciousness of people ever since. We have a runoff election in Georgia today among Republican candidates for governor and so forth, which I'm watching with interest and some element of disgust. But we have obviously a chance to vote on these issues on occasion. And I would say that the problem now with racial divide is probably greater than I've known in my adult lifetime. And it's not only a matter of discriminating against African Americans, but it's also a matter of discriminating against other people who are reasonably helpless. And that would involve other minority groups and women and girls and immigrants and so forth, as you know. So a basic element of racism comes out every now and then, and it is largely controlled by the attitude of our top leaders who have a bully pulpit of the White House or other places to speak out. And when that voice in the White House is the wrong voice for racial equality or other equality, then I think our country suffers. So I think that racism is very bad now. We need to speak out individually when it comes under our purview, under our observation, and use our voice, as I've described already in a previous question, to our public officials and to the news media and to our circle of friends to express our own personal viewpoint.
Just a couple of more. And when integrity, this is from a human rights defender here, when integrity is absent, can we still protect the political system from corruption, which ultimately can destroy democracy?
Well, the integrity of an individual office holder obviously can't be controlled once they are elected to public office by democratic means. But I think the condemnation of the public who observes that person violating the elements of or standards of society can be important. So I think there again, for each one of us in our own organization to speak out and condemn obvious evidence of corruption is the only thing that can control a person who lacks personal integrity.
In your opening address, you mentioned that as you and Mrs. Carter transition away from leadership roles, the center may start to take on more U.S.-focused projects. What do you hope it will focus on? Poverty, elections, individual freedoms, immigration?
I think, to use one quick phrase, human rights. And as I kind of amended that statement that you're going to issue here during the noon hour, I think human rights basically comes down to one question, and that is the equal treatment of human beings. One of my favorite verses in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, and the Jewish Bible, is is when it says that there is no more Greek or Jew or Gentile. There is no more slave or master. There is no more male or female, because all people are equal in the eyes of God. And if we could just take that one final phrase, all people are equal in the eyes of God, and we individually, as we relate to other people, or our governments as we establish laws, would just honor that phrase, all people should be treated equally and be given equal chance to take whatever talent or ability that they have and utilize it to the utmost for the benefit of society. That's the key to the question. That's a very difficult thing for us to accomplish. We've tried it now in the Christian faith for more than 2,000 years, and we haven't yet succeeded, of course. But I think that in individual countries, we can try it and succeed if possible. And in some countries can become sterling examples of how to deal with human rights and equality of treatment. I'd say Norway would be one good example, and other Nordic countries are good examples. And the most important single country, though, to have a commitment to human rights is the United States of America, because it's so influential in the rest of the world. So just treat people equally. And then you would do away with discrimination against African Americans or immigrants or mentally ill people or prisoners or women and children. That's my best answer.
Well, I only have one more. This is the last one, because it'll give you, a human rights defender wants to know, it is 2018 and yet we are still here. If there was one thing you would advise we focus our energies and resources on, what would it be?
I really believe, let me say before I close out my comments, I don't know I'm not an oracle. I don't know all the answers to everything, obviously, which has become obvious to all of you, I'm sure, this afternoon. But I would say that last statement that I made is the most important, and that is for us, in our own attitude toward other people around us, even to members of our own family, our own community, or on every level of our life experiences, if we would just treat equally God's people, women, girls, African Americans, minorities of all kinds, the poor, the mentally ill, the people in prison. I don't need to name them all again, but I think if we just would do that and fight for that principle with every degree of influence that we have in the organizations that you represent or the countries that you represent, and do it courageously, I think collectively we could change the world for the better. Thank you all.
Thank you, President Carter. That concludes our program together. But what remains is to thank all of you human rights defenders who committed your time to join us, and many of you coming long distances, to join us here to advance all our work together. So again, thank you very much for being here. As before, please remain seated, and I have a few more instructions. As President Carter and Mrs. Carter leave, I'll give you those instructions. So please keep your name tags for security, because we are still having dinner together this evening at 5:30. I would ask, as we did at lunch, those of you that have dinner on the back of your badge, a sticker for dinner, if you would go to the back of the room and find the volunteers that will help you get to your places at dinner. And we'd ask that those people could go ahead and exit now. Well, we are ending early. I just want to ensure that those of you that do have a sticker on the back of your badge for dinner are seated well before 5:30, before President Carter and Mrs. Carter do join us. So while we do have more break time, please make sure, if you don't know where you're going, that you've talked to one of the volunteers in the back that can help you. Other than that, I just want to thank you for all your time and energy and commitment, and enjoy your dinner.